Imagine opening your eyes nearly 2 million years ago. The sun has just begun to rise above the horizon of the African savanna. The morning air is still cool, but within only a few hours, relentless heat will blanket this vast land. Before you stretches an endless sea of grasslands, breathtakingly beautiful, yet filled with constant danger. Somewhere in the distance, a pride of lions has just finished its hunt under the cover of darkness. Hyenas are beginning to gather, waiting for the chance to steal whatever scraps remain. Giant elephants move silently across the plains, while predators lie hidden beneath grass taller than a human being. You have no house, no farmland, no city, no metal, no electricity. You do not even possess a fully developed language like modern humans. The only thing you know with absolute certainty is that you must survive until the sun sets. In that world, humans do not stand at the top of the food chain. We are merely a relatively small species of primate, slower than a cheetah, weaker than a lion, without the claws of a bear or the fangs of a wolf. By every standard nature has ever imposed, humans should have been just another prey animal wandering the great African plains. And yet, something extraordinary happened. A human species appeared and began doing something no ancestor before it had ever done. They walked. Not for a few days, not for a few seasons, but across thousands of generations. They left their homeland in Africa. They crossed scorching deserts. They journeyed through dense forests. They climbed over towering mountain ranges. And eventually, they reached lands that no human species had ever known before. That species was Homo erectus, a human ancestor rarely given the attention it deserves, yet perhaps the single most important turning point in the entire story of human evolution. When we think about humanity's success, we usually think of Homo sapiens. We picture cave paintings, towering pyramids, ships crossing vast oceans, or spacecraft traveling into the darkness of space. These achievements make it seem as though modern humans were the beginning of every great milestone in history. But what if that story actually began much earlier? What if the foundation of everything that makes us human today was laid nearly 2 million years ago by a species that vanished long before civilization ever existed? Scientists believe that Homo erectus first appeared in Africa around 1.9 million years ago. Fossil evidence reveals a body unlike that of any earlier ancestor. Longer legs, shorter arms, a larger brain, and a physique built to travel immense distances. Archaeological discoveries also show that they crafted increasingly sophisticated stone tools and became the first human species to expand beyond Africa. They were not the strongest creatures, nor the fastest. They possessed neither terrifying jaws nor razor-sharp claws. And yet, somehow, they accomplished what almost no other human species ever could. They endured. Not for tens of thousands of years, but for nearly 2 million years. To put that into perspective, Homo sapiens, our own species, has existed for only about 300,000 years. That means Homo erectus survived for far longer than the entire history of modern humanity. During that immense span of time, Earth's climate shifted again and again. Ice ages came and went. Countless animal species appeared, flourished, and disappeared forever. Yet they remained. What made them so different? Was it their bodies, their brains, their ability to cooperate? Or was it the curiosity that drove them toward lands no human had ever dared to enter? This is not merely the story of an extinct human species. It is the story of the moment humanity began changing its relationship with the natural world. Every journey we take today, every road we choose to walk without knowing what lies ahead, every time we choose exploration over the comfort of the familiar. Perhaps all of it still carries the echoes of decisions first made nearly 2 million years ago. Because before we can understand why Homo sapiens came to dominate this planet, we must answer an even older question. What made Homo erectus, the first human species, truly worthy of the title, the Great Master of Survival? Why was Homo erectus the first human species to leave Africa? If you had to choose a single moment that changed the entire course of human history, many people would point to the discovery of fire, the invention of agriculture, or the rise of the first cities. But anthropologists look even further back. They look to the moment when a small group of Homo erectus made the decision to keep walking instead of turning back toward the familiar. It sounds simple, But in a world nearly 2 million years ago, it may have been the boldest decision any human species had ever made. Because every step forward meant leaving behind familiar water sources, well-known hunting grounds, and the shelters their ancestors had depended on for hundreds of thousands of years. There were no maps ahead, no signs pointing the way. No one knew whether the next hill concealed a fertile grassland or a lifeless wasteland. No one knew whether the river ahead could be crossed. No one knew what predators lay hidden inside those unfamiliar forests. This was not merely a journey. It was a gamble with survival itself. What is truly astonishing is that Homo erectus won that gamble. Archaeological evidence shows that only a few 100,000 years after first appearing in Africa, they had already reached what is now Georgia. From there, they continued spreading into China, Indonesia, and many other regions across Eurasia. Never before had any human species expanded its range on such a remarkable scale. The question is, why them? What enabled a primate born in the tropics to adapt to temperate climates, freezing winters, and ecosystems unlike anything its ancestors had ever encountered? Scientists believe the answer was not a single revolutionary invention. Instead, it was a combination of many small changes that, together, produced one of the greatest leaps in evolutionary history. The first was their body. Fossil evidence shows that Homo erectus possessed significantly longer legs than earlier human ancestors. Their pelvis, knees, and feet shared many features with those of modern humans. These adaptations made long-distance walking far more efficient while dramatically reducing the amount of energy required for every kilometer traveled. But what is even more remarkable is that they didn't simply know how to walk. They knew how to walk far. While many modern primates remain dependent on relatively small foraging territories, Homo erectus appears to have transformed movement itself into a survival strategy. When food became scarce, they didn't have to fight desperately over what remained. They could leave. When the climate changed, they didn't have to wait for conditions to improve. They could search for a new land instead. Today, that ability may seem perfectly ordinary, but nearly 2 million years ago, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Researchers also believe that the body of Homo erectus evolved specifically to endure long journeys beneath the unforgiving African sun. Their changing limb proportions, increased number of sweat glands, and gradually reduced body hair allowed them to cool themselves far more effectively while moving continuously. This gave them an advantage that many predators simply did not possess. A cheetah can sprint with astonishing speed, but only for a few brief moments. A lion must rest after every chase. Humans, however, could simply keep moving. One step at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 day at a time. Anthropologists call this endurance, and in evolution, endurance is sometimes more valuable than speed. Imagine a herd of antelope beneath the blazing midday sun. They can outrun any human with ease. But if a group of Homo erectus relentlessly followed them from morning until evening without giving up, the prey would eventually collapse from exhaustion and overheating, while the hunters continued forward at the same steady rhythm. Some researchers believe that this form of persistence hunting may have played a crucial role in the survival strategy of our ancestors. It was not a victory of strength. It was a victory of perseverance. And perhaps, it was also the very first metaphor for what it means to be human. We are rarely the strongest species, but throughout history, we have often been the one that refuses to give up. Yet even a perfectly adapted body cannot fully explain how Homo erectus conquered unfamiliar worlds. Because on every one of those journeys, they faced an enemy even more dangerous than lions, storms, or starvation. That enemy was uncertainty. How could an ancient brain make decisions when everything that lay ahead belonged to a world it had never seen before? That question leads us to the next great turning point in the story of the first humans who truly became Earth's explorers. What changed inside the brain of Homo erectus? What changed inside the brain of Homo erectus? There is a fascinating paradox in the story of human evolution. Leaving Africa was not merely a physical challenge, it was an intellectual one. A lion does not need to plan next year's hunting season. A cheetah does not need to imagine what lies beyond the next mountain. Most animals live almost entirely in the present. They react to whatever is happening directly in front of them. Humans, however, are different. To walk into a land no one has ever explored before, you must possess one extraordinary ability. You must believe that a path still exists ahead, even when you cannot yet see it. That is, the ability to imagine the future. Anthropologists believe this was one of the greatest turning points in the evolution of Homo erectus. Although their brains were still smaller than those of Homo sapiens, they were significantly larger than those of earlier human ancestors. Their average brain volume ranged from roughly 800 to over 1,000 cubic centimeters, reflecting a remarkable increase in cognitive capacity. Yet brain size alone was never the most important factor. What truly mattered was how that brain was used. Archaeological evidence reveals that Homo erectus no longer relied simply on naturally sharp stones they happened to find. They began manufacturing tools according to a deliberate design. The famous Acheulean hand axe is one of the best-known examples. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a chipped piece of stone. But look more closely, and something extraordinary begins to emerge. Its two sides are remarkably symmetrical. Its edges were intentionally shaped. Every strike seems to have been planned before it was made. That means the toolmaker wasn't merely thinking about the next blow. They had already imagined the finished tool before they ever picked up the stone. Today, that may sound completely ordinary. But imagine what it meant nearly 2 million years ago. For the first time in history, a human species could transform an invisible idea into a physical object. In other words, they no longer simply reacted to the world. They began shaping the world to fit their needs. Scientists believe this process required the ability to plan multiple steps ahead, remember a sequence of actions, and correct mistakes while the work was still in progress. Those are the foundations of strategic thinking. And once a brain learns how to plan the making of a hand axe, it can also plan a hunt, a migration, the search for water, or even the survival of an entire group. That was a leap very few animals have ever achieved. Yet there was another side to this evolutionary breakthrough. A larger brain came with an enormous cost. The human brain consumes an extraordinary amount of energy. Although it accounts for only a small fraction of total body weight, it demands an immense supply of calories to function. For Homo erectus, this created a challenge unlike anything their ancestors had ever faced. To think better, they needed to eat better. To eat better, they needed to hunt more effectively. To hunt more effectively, they needed to cooperate more successfully. And so, every evolutionary change triggered another. Evolution does not create miracles overnight. It is more like pulling a single thread. When one end begins to move, the entire fabric slowly changes with it. A larger brain produced better tools. Better tools secured more food. More food nourished larger brains. And larger brains generated even better ideas. It became a powerful, positive feedback loop that may have continued for hundreds of thousands of years. But perhaps the most astonishing part of this story was never the hand axe itself. It was what happened after it had been made. Imagine an adult sitting beside a child. He picks up a stone. Strike. Turn. Chip. Flip. Strike again. The child is not merely watching a tool being created. The child is watching a process, learning that every action has a purpose, that every step leads naturally to the next. Scientists believe this may have marked the moment when passing knowledge from one generation to another became more important than ever before. Knowledge no longer disappeared when an individual died. It began living inside the memory of the entire community. That was the moment biological evolution started joining forces with something entirely new, the evolution of knowledge. And once knowledge could be passed from one individual to another, from one generation to the next, a species no longer evolved through genes alone. It began evolving through learning. That may have been one of humanity's greatest inventions. Yet even a brain capable of planning could not fully explain the success of Homo erectus. Because when darkness fell, all of that intelligence still had to confront an enemy that millions of years of evolution had taught every primate to fear: the dark. What happened when our ancestors stopped fearing the night the way every other animal did? That may have been the moment the human world changed forever. Was Homo erectus the first human species to conquer the night? Was Homo erectus the first human species to conquer the night? Imagine the sun slowly sinking below the horizon. Only minutes ago, the entire savanna was bathed in daylight. But now, the world is changing. Shadows grow longer. The songs of daytime birds fall silent. The air becomes colder. And then, new sounds begin to emerge. A distant roar echoes across the plains. Moments later comes the eerie laughter of hyenas in the darkness. Somewhere out there, a pair of eyes is quietly watching. For most primates, the night has always been the most terrifying time of day. When daylight disappears, vision, their most important sense, becomes almost useless. Nocturnal predators suddenly gain the advantage. It is no coincidence that modern baboons, chimpanzees, and orangutans all seek safe places to rest before darkness falls. For millions of years of evolution, darkness meant danger. But then, something changed. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Wonderwork Cave in South Africa has revealed ancient traces of ash, burned bones, and charred plant material. Many researchers believe that Homo erectus may have learned to maintain and use fire remarkably early, although exactly when they truly mastered it remains the subject of ongoing scientific debate. What is fascinating is this: whether they were the first humans to create fire themselves, or simply learned to preserve flames sparked by lightning or wildfires, the outcome was the same. For the first time in history, humans no longer surrendered completely when the sun went down. Picture a group of Homo erectus sitting together in a circle. At the center burns a small fire. Its flickering light dances across faces still covered in dust after a long day of hunting. Far beyond the glow, the eyes of predators still shimmer in the darkness, but they no longer dare come too close. Fire did more than create light. It created a space that had never existed before. A sanctuary in the middle of the wilderness. Anthropologists believe this may have been one of the most profound turning points in all of human history. For the first time, people no longer spent every waking moment searching for food or fleeing from predators. They gained something entirely new: a few precious hours after sunset. At first, a few extra hours may not seem important, but imagine those hours repeating every single day for hundreds of thousands of years. That is enough time to change an entire civilization. Time to repair tools. Time for children to watch adults shape stone. Time to care for infants. Time for elders to pass on the lessons of countless hunts. Time for the group to prepare for tomorrow. Some scientists even suggest that evenings around the campfire created the perfect environment for the development of social communication and symbolic thought. If that is true, then fire did not simply illuminate the forest. It began illuminating the human mind. Yet fire offered another remarkable advantage that receives far less attention: food. Before fire, many kinds of meat and tough plants demanded enormous amounts of energy to chew and digest. Once food was cooked, everything changed. Meat became softer. Many roots and tubers became easier to digest. The body could extract far more energy from exactly the same amount of food. Current research indicates that eating cooked food may have supported the expansion of the human brain by increasing the amount of usable energy the body could obtain from its diet. Although scientists continue debating precisely when this transition occurred, the central idea remains compelling. Fire did not simply transform our meals. It transformed the entire way the human body functioned. And yet, its greatest gift may not have been light, or warmth, or even food. Perhaps its greatest gift was the feeling it created. Think about the last time you sat beside a campfire. Almost instinctively, you wanted to sit close to other people, to talk, to listen, to share something. That is not a random reaction. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that fire may have fundamentally changed the way humans interacted with one another. As an entire group gathered around a single source of light, the distance between individuals naturally became smaller. Eye contact became more frequent. Gestures became easier to see. Sharing knowledge became more effective than ever before. If daylight was the time for survival, then nighttime may have become the time for building society. And perhaps, within the flickering light of those first campfires, humans began mastering a skill even more important than hunting: cooperation. Because in the end, what allowed Homo erectus to survive for nearly 2 million years may not have been the strength of any single individual. It may have been the ability to make an entire group stronger simply by bringing them together. That leads us to the next chapter in the story of the first humans who truly became the masters of survival. The greatest strength of Homo erectus was never muscle. The greatest strength of Homo erectus was never muscle. If you had to face a lion alone, the outcome would almost certainly be decided before the encounter even began. If you had to race a cheetah, you would lose. If you had to wrestle a bear, you would stand almost no chance. Taken as individuals, Homo erectus was not an intimidating creature. They were not fast. They had no claws, no thick protective hide, no powerful jaws capable of tearing apart prey like the great carnivores. Even more remarkably, they required many years to reach adulthood, while their young remained dependent on adults for an exceptionally long time. By the standards of nature, they seemed to be the perfect recipe for extinction. And yet, something extraordinary happened. Homo erectus did not triumph because of what a single individual could accomplish. They triumphed because of what an entire group could achieve together. That distinction is profoundly important. In nature, many species live in groups. Wolves hunt in packs, lions hunt in prides, hyenas hunt in clans. But their cooperation is primarily focused on hunting or defending territory. Humans began cooperating in an entirely different way. Anthropologists believe that Homo erectus may have formed more stable social groups than earlier human species. This not only improved hunting success, but also reduced the risks of surviving in an environment that was constantly changing. Imagine a hunt. One individual discovers footprints. Another studies the direction of the wind. The strongest members move around both sides to cut off the escape. Meanwhile, the elders, perhaps no longer fast enough to run, remember the landscape, the water sources, and the migration routes of the animals. Not everyone performs the same task, but every individual contributes something essential to the success of the entire group. Evolution calls this role specialization. And remarkably, it is exactly what we still do today. Inside a hospital, one person is a doctor, another is a nurse, another is a medical technician, another manages the entire system. No single individual can operate the whole hospital alone. But together, they create something infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. Perhaps the first seeds of that principle were planted during the age of Homo erectus. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Homo erectus campsites contain large collections of stone tools, animal bones, and concentrated traces of daily activity. These findings indicate that they did not simply pass through these locations. They returned to them again and again, gradually transforming them into familiar places shared by the entire community. That leads to another fascinating question. If humans began living in stronger, more connected groups, what happened to the weakest members? In the world of most animals, an injured individual rarely survives for long. But among humans, the picture appears to have been different. Fossils from several ancient human species reveal individuals who suffered severe injuries, yet continued living for many years afterward. That suggests they may have received care from others within their group. Although many of the best-known examples belong to human species that appeared after Homo erectus, researchers believe this tendency to care for one another may have begun much earlier in our evolutionary history. It is an extraordinary idea, because in nature, caring for someone who can no longer hunt, sharing food with a child, protecting an elderly individual, all consume valuable resources. From the perspective of a single individual, it appears to be a disadvantage, but from the perspective of the group, it becomes an investment. The elderly preserve memory. They remember where water can still be found during droughts. They know when the herds will return. They recognize which plants are safe to eat. They remember mistakes the younger generation has never experienced. In other words, they become the living library of the community. An individual may die, but if their knowledge has already been passed on, the group continues growing stronger. That is the moment evolution begins, depending on something beyond DNA. It begins depending on collective memory. This is one of the most important concepts in anthropology, because humanity's greatest strength has never been muscle. It has always been our ability to accumulate experience across generations. Each generation does not have to begin from nothing. Instead, it stands upon everything the generations before it have already learned. That is why a relatively fragile species could gradually overcome rivals that were vastly stronger. Yet this remarkable level of cooperation introduced a completely new challenge. How could dozens of different individuals act as one unified group? How did they know when to hunt, when to move, when to warn one another of danger? That required something even more powerful than stone tools or fire. It required communication. And that ability may have been the next great leap that transformed Homo erectus into the first human species to truly reshape its own destiny. What happened when humans began to understand one another? Try conducting a hunt. Without speaking, without using gestures, without making eye contact. You will quickly discover it is almost impossible. One person runs too early. Another turns the wrong way. Someone else doesn't know when to attack. A single small mistake is enough to ruin the entire hunt. So then, how could Homo erectus coordinate across vast open grasslands when they were pursuing prey that was faster, stronger, and far more alert than they were? This is one of the most fascinating questions in anthropology, because even today, we still do not know exactly how advanced the language of Homo erectus truly was. Did they possess a complete language like Homo sapiens? Or did they rely only on simple vocalizations combined with gestures? Scientists are still debating the answer. But there is one point on which most researchers agree. Even if their language remained primitive, it was almost certainly far more advanced than that of the earlier human species that came before them. Current research indicates that the evolution of Homo erectus, their larger brains, changing anatomy, and increasingly social way of life, most likely required a more effective communication system to sustain cooperation. Think about it. You cannot teach a child how to craft a stone hand axe simply by shouting. You cannot organize a hunt using nothing but roars. And you certainly cannot warn an entire group about a pride of lions hiding behind the tall grass if every sound carries only a single meaning. Survival had begun to depend on the ability to share information. Perhaps, in the beginning, there were only a handful of different sounds. One sound meant danger. Another called the group together. Another pointed toward a source of food. Then, little by little, those sounds became combined with gestures, with eye contact, with facial expressions, with body posture. Anthropologists propose that human language did not appear in a single miraculous moment. It grew gradually, like a small stream that, over hundreds of thousands of years, eventually became a mighty river. The astonishing part is this. Even if the vocabulary of Homo erectus was extremely limited, the moment they could share intentions with one another, the world changed forever. Imagine one individual pointing toward the horizon. He makes a sound. Everyone understands. Not what is happening now, but what is about to happen. The herd will pass through that valley. The water lies beyond the next hill. Or, danger is waiting ahead. That was an extraordinary leap forward, because for the first time in history, information was no longer limited to what each individual could personally see. It could be shared. And once information could be shared, experience could be shared, mistakes could be shared, successes could be shared. That was the moment knowledge began traveling faster than genes. Scientists often describe this process as cultural evolution. Unlike biological evolution, which may require thousands of generations to produce a small change, cultural evolution can happen in a single afternoon. One person discovers a better way to shape stone. The next day, the entire group knows it. One individual learns that a particular fruit is poisonous. If that lesson is communicated successfully, everyone else is spared from paying for the same mistake with their own lives. Few animals on Earth possess an advantage anything like this. But perhaps, the greatest miracle of communication was never the transfer of information. It was the creation of trust. Imagine a large hunting expedition. The group splits into two directions. If each person believes only what they can see with their own eyes, the entire plan collapses instantly. They must trust that everyone else is carrying out their role. They must believe that when the prey runs toward the valley, someone will already be waiting there. That trust cannot be seen. It cannot be touched. Yet it possesses the power to hold an entire community together. And this is where humans began separating themselves profoundly from most other animals. We do not cooperate only because instinct tells us to. We cooperate because we share an idea, a plan, a common goal, a shared story. Those invisible ideas became the foundation of every society that followed, from a small hunting band on the African savanna to villages, cities, civilizations, and eventually, the modern world. Yet despite their ability to cooperate, communicate, and plan ahead, Homo erectus still faced an opponent that no amount of intelligence could ever fully control. It was not predators. not disease, not even other human species. It was the Earth itself. Because during nearly 2 million years of existence, our planet changed again, and again, and again. So how did Homo erectus survive hundreds of thousands of years of dramatic climate upheaval? Perhaps that was the greatest challenge they ever overcame. The greatest enemy of Homo erectus was not predators. It was a planet that never stopped changing. If you asked a paleontologist what the most dangerous force Homo erectus ever faced was, the answer would probably surprise you. Not lions, not hyenas, not even the gigantic saber-toothed cats that once ruled vast regions of the Earth. Their most terrifying enemy was the climate. Unlike predators, which threatened them for only minutes or hours, climate could transform an entire world over thousands of years. Imagine being born into a lush green grassland. Every season, herds of antelope migrate across the plains. Rivers flow with fresh water. Trees bear fruit. Wildlife is everywhere. Then, year after year, the rains begin to fade. The grass turns yellow. The lakes slowly disappear. The herds vanish with them. The world your parents once knew no longer exists. What would you do? Stay or leave? Throughout the nearly 2 million years that Homo erectus existed, the Earth never stood still. Current research indicates that the planet passed through repeated cycles of cooling and warming, drought and rainfall. These environmental shifts constantly reshaped landscapes, water sources, and entire ecosystems across vast regions. For countless animal species, that was a death sentence. They were too specialized, too dependent on a single food source, or adapted to survive in only one specific habitat. When that environment disappeared, they disappeared with it. That is why Earth's history is filled with species that dominated for millions of years, only to vanish almost overnight. But Homo erectus followed a different path. Instead of trying to preserve the old way of life, they changed. If the grasslands disappeared, they searched for new ones. If the herds migrated, they followed them. If the forests dried out, they learned how to survive somewhere else. It sounds simple, but in evolutionary terms, it was an extraordinarily rare strategy. Most living creatures adapt by changing their bodies. Humans adapted by changing their behavior. That was a revolutionary difference. Anthropologists call this behavioral flexibility. It is the ability to solve the same problem in many different ways. A polar bear cannot decide to live in a desert tomorrow. A camel cannot move into a tropical rainforest. But humans can. Not because our bodies are perfect, but because our brains allow us to learn faster than biological evolution can keep pace. That was Homo erectus' greatest strength. They did not wait for their bodies to evolve first. They changed the way they lived. Perhaps today they hunted antelope. Tomorrow they hunted wild horses. A few years later, they learned to exploit fish, turtles, or smaller animals. A tool could be improved. A hunting strategy could be adjusted. A migration route could be changed. Those are things DNA cannot accomplish within a single lifetime, but culture can. What is truly remarkable is that this flexibility did more than help Homo erectus survive. It expanded their world. Every new land brought new challenges, but it also brought new opportunities, a better kind of stone for making tools, a more reliable source of water, larger herds of animals, or a landscape with less competition. In other words, what many species saw as a crisis, humans began learning to transform into opportunity. That is an astonishingly modern way of thinking, and perhaps it first appeared very early in our evolutionary history. Now take a moment to look at our own lives today. When technology changes, we learn new skills. When jobs disappear, we create new ones. When society changes, we change with it. Few people realize that is not a uniquely modern human trait. It may well be a legacy that Homo erectus passed down nearly 2 million years ago. The ability to adapt, the ability to learn, and above all, the determination never to let circumstances decide our fate. Yet after all of those extraordinary achievements, one difficult question still remains. If Homo erectus was so adaptable, if they survived for nearly 2 million years, if they spread across 3 continents, then why did they disappear? What could possibly defeat the species once considered the first true masters of survival? That is the final mystery, and perhaps the most important chapter in this entire story. If Homo erectus were masters of survival, why did they still go extinct? At first glance, it seems completely illogical. Just think back over the journey we've taken. Homo erectus was the first human species to leave Africa. They adapted to an extraordinary variety of environments. They developed more advanced tools. They learned to cooperate. They may even have mastered the use of fire. And they endured for nearly 2 million years. If any human species deserves to be called evolution's greatest success story, it is surely them. So why are they no longer here? This remains one of the greatest mysteries in paleoanthropology, and what makes it even more fascinating is this. Even today, there is no single answer. Scientists do not believe that Homo erectus disappeared because of one isolated cause. Quite the opposite. Current research indicates that their extinction was most likely the result of multiple overlapping factors unfolding over an immensely long period of time. The first thing we must understand is this. Evolution never promises immortality. A species can flourish for millions of years. But if the environment continues changing, the very strategy that once guaranteed its success can eventually become its greatest limitation. Imagine you are an elite marathon runner. For years, your incredible endurance makes you unbeatable. Then one day, the rules change. The competition is no longer a marathon. It becomes a mountain climbing race. The ability that once made you extraordinary suddenly isn't enough anymore. Something very much like that may have happened to Homo erectus. Between roughly 800,000 and 300,000 years ago, Earth's climate became increasingly unstable. Ice ages grew more severe, sea levels rose and fell dramatically, and ecosystems repeatedly disappeared only to emerge once again. Some populations of Homo erectus may have adapted successfully. Others did not. One important point is often overlooked. Homo erectus was not a single unified population. They were spread across Africa and much of Asia. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these populations gradually became more and more different from one another. Some adapted to open grasslands. Some lived in forests. Some thrived in mild climates. Others endured harsh winters. This diversity helped them survive for an astonishing length of time. But it also meant that each population ultimately faced a different fate. Then, a new character stepped onto the stage of history. Homo sapiens. Not suddenly, not through one great war, but little by little. Archaeological evidence shows that Homo sapiens possessed several important advantages: larger brains, more diverse stone tool technologies, and an increasingly powerful capacity for cultural adaptation. Yet perhaps their greatest advantage was not physical at all. It was the speed of innovation. While many Homo erectus tools remained remarkably unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, the tools of Homo sapiens evolved far more rapidly. New ideas emerged, new techniques spread. Creativity itself became an evolutionary advantage. Anthropologists propose that once the speed of learning and knowledge sharing reached a certain point, a species no longer merely adapted to the world around it. It began changing the world faster than the environment could change it. That was an extraordinary difference. Perhaps Homo erectus were exceptional survivors, but Homo sapiens became something new, a species capable of continually reinventing itself. And in evolution, the winner is not always the strongest, nor the one that survives the longest. Sometimes, the winner is simply the one that changes fastest when the world changes. That does not mean Homo erectus failed. Quite the opposite. Viewed across the entire sweep of human evolution, they remain one of the greatest success stories our lineage has ever known. Nearly 2 million years, thousands upon thousands of generations, 3 continents, countless climate catastrophes, and still, they endured. That is an achievement that even Homo sapiens today has not yet come close to surpassing. Perhaps. We have always looked at history through the eyes of the survivor. We remember the species that still exists, and forget those that disappeared. But without Homo erectus, there may never have been Homo sapiens, because they did not simply pass down a few biological traits. They passed down a way of living, a way of thinking, a way of confronting the unknown. And that brings us to one final question. If the legacy of Homo erectus still lives on, did they ever truly disappear? Or does a part of them still survive inside every modern human? That is where the story of an ancient human species becomes the story of Homo erectus never truly disappeared. Imagine this. A morning nearly 2 million years ago. A lone Homo erectus stands atop a hill. Before him lies a land unlike anything he has ever seen. No human has ever walked there. No one knows whether water can be found ahead. No one knows whether predators are waiting in the distance. No one knows how long the journey will last. He could turn back. The familiar paths are still behind him. The rivers he has always known are still there. The places where his ancestors lived for countless generations still await him. But he does not turn around. He takes one more step, then another, and another. Perhaps that single moment changed the entire course of human history. When we look back at Homo erectus, it is easy to make a mistake. We see them as primitive humans, less intelligent, less advanced, merely an outdated chapter before the arrival of Homo sapiens. But archaeology tells a very different story. They were the first humans to transform movement into a survival strategy, the first to expand their world far beyond their African homeland, among the first to craft tools with deliberate planning and precision, perhaps even the first to preserve fire across generations. And most importantly of all, they were the first to prove that humans do not need to become the strongest creatures on Earth in order to survive. We simply need to become the most adaptable. That is the greatest lesson Homo erectus left behind. In nature, strength always has its limits. Speed is eventually surpassed. Even enormous size cannot last forever. After all, even the dinosaurs, once the undisputed rulers of Earth, eventually disappeared. But the ability to learn, the ability to cooperate, and the ability to adapt, those are the qualities that enable a species to endure through millions of years of change. What is remarkable is that, after nearly 2 million years, we are still living by the very strategy Homo erectus chose. We still leave behind familiar places to explore lands no one has ever known. We still invent new tools whenever the world changes. We still pass knowledge from one generation to the next. We still work alongside people we have never met to build things that no individual could ever accomplish alone. In fact, at this very moment, you and I are participating in that same process. You are listening to discoveries built upon centuries of scientific research. Archaeologists excavate ancient fossils. Anthropologists decode human behavior. Biologists analyze DNA. Geologists read Earth's history layer by layer through the rocks beneath our feet. That knowledge passes from one person to another, from one generation to the next, till, eventually, it reaches us. That is precisely the process Homo erectus began, long before the first civilization ever existed. There is a beautiful paradox hidden within this story. Biologically, Homo erectus became extinct, but evolutionarily, they never truly left this world. Every time a child asks a curious question, every time a scientist ventures into territory no one has ever explored, every time someone has the courage to leave behind the safety of the familiar in search of a better future, we are repeating the very choice our distant ancestors once made. Perhaps, what makes us human is not the biggest brain, not modern technology, not skyscrapers, not spacecraft. What makes us human is our willingness to keep walking toward the horizon, even when we have no idea what waits beyond it. That is why the story of Homo erectus is not simply the story of a human species that vanished. It is the story of the origin of resilience, of curiosity, of adaptability, and of the instinct to explore that has been passed down through millions of years of evolution. We may no longer wear the face of Homo erectus, but every time humanity overcomes a new challenge, every time we bravely step into the unknown, a part of them is still walking beside us. And perhaps, that is the deepest meaning of evolution. Not that any species lives forever, but that the finest qualities of one species can continue living through those that come after it. Homo erectus may have disappeared from the earth long ago, but the spirit of the first human species to truly become the great master of survival has never disappeared. If you enjoy exploring the origins of humanity, archaeology, and the mysteries of evolution, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming documentaries, because the journey of humankind did not begin with us, and one thing is certain, it will not end with us.